The days that we have lived in is days, with all of this COVID, I hope that it has taught us something, and that God would just help us to demonstrate His love, His grace unto all. Well, this morning, I was thinking just a few weeks ago, Dr. Fry was talking about how he had deleted his message. Don't laugh too much. I have been working on this message, and last night I went to print my message, and as I sat down with our laptop at the dining room table, my wife was in the kitchen. She says, "You're not going to be able to print that message." And she says, "We're out of ink." So I jumped in the car, ran to Walmart, got the ink, came home, put the cartridge in, went to print, and it would not print. Don't ask me why. I did a lot of praying, a lot of stressing. I walked away, I came back, I did a lot of praying, and finally my wife got it to print. But the black was not working that I went to get. And so this morning I have a red message. You know, red letters in the Bible means the words of the Lord. So as it began to print, there was a little hiccup with the printing, okay? So I printed a couple pages, and then it stopped or something, and then a few minutes later it started printing the rest of it. So I assumed that as the wrong thing to do, is that as it restarted the entire message. So I took those couple of pages that had started out, and I threw them away. I came to church this morning, sat down in my office, was wanting to go through my message, and I got to a point when there was no more message. And I realized I had threw away the last half of the message. So I ran upstairs, prayed again, drove across town rapidly, or in a very spirited way. Got home, ran in the house. I thought I will do something that I don't like to do, but I will find it in the trash can. Walked in and realized that there was this much trash on top of where it would have been. Lord, help us all this morning. Have you ever had one? Brother Barr preached that message. Have you ever had one of those days? So I quickly reprinted the message and still have a red message here this morning. So that has been my morning. A little bit stressful, but we are here. And the Spirit of God is here this morning. And church, let us never take that for granted. And you know, this is just a demonstration of how so often we can get so focused and so wrapped up in one thing, but miss that we're right here in the midst of the presence. I can be overcome, I can be a little bit stressed, and I can be sit here like this morning. But you know what, if I don't sit back and realize, oh God, you're here. I just want to worship you this morning more than anything else. Lord, I just want to worship you and be in your presence. That's what it's about, friends. Let's not miss it. Maybe you came this morning and maybe you couldn't find your keys before church. Maybe the kids threw up or the beans burned. I don't know. And you came in this morning a little bit frazzled. Sit back. God's here. And worship him this morning. Well, this morning, I want us to go back. Just a few weeks ago, I spoke on a portrait of God, and us looking at God and seeing him who he is. Many people have been so fascinated, and I think that we all have been fascinated with what God looks like. And I think over this last year, we have lost so many people that have been so dear to us, and many people that were in our own congregation, saints of God and Christians. And as they have passed, oftentimes we wonder, what was the first thing that they saw as they crossed from this life into the next? What is it? What is it that God looks like? I'm sure I'm not the only one. But a few weeks I preached on that topic of the portraits and what does a portrait do. But a portrait allows us insight into a person. It allows us to see what they look like. Sometimes they're a little bit more understandable. In portraits, we see a culmination of all that person's traits coming together. A portrait is not just an eye or just a chin or just a nose or an ear. That's not a portrait. But when all of those features come together, it gives us a more clear image of that person. And friends, this morning more than ever before, we need to understand God and who He is. What does He look like? Having the right concept of this being, this person, it shapes our other beliefs. It shapes as we begin to think about salvation, my friends. If we understand God and who He is, then it gives a more clear picture and image, and we understand salvation a little bit more. And when we understand God and we understand who He is and what He looks like, we understand perhaps grace and other things that sometimes we struggle with. And too often we worship God, or we say we come to worship, but in a way we see ourselves here and we see God there. Friends, we really need to see Him for who He is. The last time that I preached, I spoke on the infinitude of God, and this characteristics is one that shows God as having no limits, no beginning, and no end. He has always been, and He will always be. He is what they say, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning, the end. When we think of time, we look and we can put it at a period and point, but beyond that point, there was God. And when we think in a future, we think of some kind of end, either death or the end. But my friend, there is God that has no end. He has no beginning. He has no end. When we think of things being boundless or unlimited or infinite, those, as I said the last time, are only words that can truly be applied to God. So this morning, I want us to think back and to look here at a portrait of God. And the scripture that, some reason we got my two messages backwards. I apologize to you for this. Stay with me. We are going to be looking over in Jeremiah 9:23. We read these words last week, and I want us to be our focus here, to be the kind of that bedrock of why we are looking at this portrait. And we read these words, "Thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and he knows me, that I am the Lord, who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord." And I want us to think this morning as we look at this portrait of God, of those words there in verse 24. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me. That he knows me, that I am the Lord. And this morning, my friend, if we can somehow begin to see a portrait and understand a little bit about God, my friends, we are going to understand and know him, and we will know that he is the Lord. You know that God desires nothing more this morning than that we might know him, and that we might know him in a personal way. And I am thankful this morning that as I look across this congregation, and we are such a vast and diverse people, that I can say that God desires nothing more than for you, and we can put your name there, that you know him, and that he already knows you, but he wants you to know him more than anything else. And if you're watching online and I can't see your face, can I tell you this morning that God desires nothing more than to know you and for you to know him. So my friend, this morning as we look at the portrait, we have already looked at this characteristic, this attribute of God that is called the infinity of God, the infinitude of God. But this morning I want us to look, and friends, sometimes I think a couple of these we start blurring at times, but there is the immensity of God. As I liked oftentimes to try to understand, and so I look up in different places, in Webster's and other places, on what is this meaning? How does man kind of describe these words? And when we look at the immensity, this one definition that I looked at said it is a state of being huge or endless. And this morning, I think that it is appropriate and that it is safe to say that God is not just huge, but my friend, God is endless this morning. I pulled out one of my systematic theology books this week, and I was reading about this thought of the immensity of God. And H. Orton Wiley states that this particular attribute or characteristic of God is directly referenced only once in the Bible, but it has parallel passages in two different places. So it's basically the same scripture but used in two places. And when we think about the immensity, this endless God, huge God this morning, 1 Kings 8:27 says this, "Behold, heaven and the highest heavens cannot contain you." Think about that this morning, friends. The heavens and the heavens of heavens cannot contain you. And Brother Doug, I was thinking if we could use that scroll in the sky, it still could not contain all of God. God cannot be contained this morning, my friends. The farthest limits that we can be conceived as just an extension of space, just as eternity cannot be conceived as just an extension of duration. Now, some of y'all maybe say, what did you just say? Too often we work within our own kind of limits there, okay? And we just say, okay, God's beyond that. But God, friends, realize that even space that we can imagine, the millions and billions of light years and miles, whatever you want to describe it, is all within God. And just as our minds have a hard time wrapping around the thought of a God with a characteristic of infinity that has no beginning and has no end, so we also sometimes struggle with this idea of the immensity of God. How big, how huge, how wide, how endless that he is. Our finite minds have to use something to try and wrap it around it. So we use words like space, we use time, we use distance. But friends, none of them can begin to measure who God is. God never has to travel to get to any place because he's already there. God is everywhere. And my friend, he's here. We have experienced him here this morning. God is above all things. He is beneath all things. He's outside of all things. He's inside of everything. God is above, but he's not pushed up. He's beneath, but he's not pressed down. He's outside, but he's not excluded. He's inside, but he's not contained. God does not have to travel to get to anywhere. He's already there. Aren't you thankful that no matter where you go, my friend, God is there? I was thinking just a few years ago when we went down to Guatemala, Brother Marcos took us on a ride. It was our first trip down there. He took us on, it took 10 hours to get to this village. And friends, I think it is the most distant place I have ever been in my life. It was in the mountains on a dirt road with drop-offs on sides of the roads. And we were places you'd think, is God even here? But I can tell you, God's there. I think of some of the most lonely places that I have stood in my life. And I'm here to tell you that God is there. There is not a place that God is not this morning. I thought of our brothers and sisters who are suffering down in Hope Sound this morning. In that warm sunshine, God's there. I thought of Seth and Heidi this morning up in Rock Lake, and I'm glad to say that God is there. I thought of my son down in Cincinnati, and God's there. And I've thought of family that are in different places, and God is there. And there's not a place that we can go this morning that God is not there. And in churches and houses and homes and huts, in jungles and in cities, places around the globe this morning, God is there. He is not restricted by space or time or distance. I like to ask the kids in junior church, kids, if I go out in the middle of the desert, is God there? They'll say yes. What if I go and I go to the bottom of the ocean? Is God there? Yeah, he's there, Brother Davis. I said, what if I go to the backside of the moon? God's there. What if I tunnel to the middle of the earth? I can tell you that God is there. When we think of the immensity of God, I like what A.W. Tozer wrote. Imagine going out millions of light years into space and finding a body so vast that you could throw all the solar systems into it, like throwing a shovel of coal into the furnace. It would simply swallow up our solar systems and go on. After you've thought of that, remember that God already contains even all of that. He's there. Brother Gene, I thought you said that we cannot consider space as just an extension of immensity. No, and that is true, my friend. You see, space is part of who? Of what he contains. Last time I preached on the infinitude of God, and after church, a group of us, we stood back there and we began to talk about this ideal of God, and we began to talk about space, and we began to talk about some of these satellites that are looking light years and millions and billions and looking. And you know what I was thinking, and I thought about that. If mankind could look beyond all, if we had the ability, and I do not believe we ever will, what would we see? And the idea came to me, we'd see God, because he's there. God is everywhere. There is not a place that we can go that God is not there. Psalms 139 says this, where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, you are there. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me and your right hand shall hold me. My friends, I'm speaking this morning about an immense God. I think about the story of Jonah. Think about the story of Jonah, a man of God who God spoke to, and God said, Jonah, I want you to go to Nineveh. But Jonah didn't want to go. And the story is beautiful in many ways. It's reflective of, sometimes, friends, of our own lives. God speaks and talks. We try to compromise with God. But Jonah did not want to go. And Jonah decided that he would run from God. And so he paid the fare. And he tried to run from God. And Brother Jerry, I was thinking about your oldest this morning. They can run all they want to. But can I tell you this morning, God was right there. In that boat, when that storm came, he was there. And when Jonah said, "You're going to have to send me over," God was there. And when he went into the belly of the well, you kind of knew my message, didn't you? God was there. You looked in my trash, didn't you?
I was there.
You was there. God was there. God was there. You say Jonah was in a lonely, dark belly's well at the bottom of the ocean. I can tell you, friends, God was there. And this morning, if you think that you can run away from God, my friend, you better get another idea, because God is there. There's not a single place you can run from and go to that God is not there. There's not a place in sin that you can find yourself that God is not there. God is there. And this morning I think of some family and I think of some friends that have wandered and went so far out in sin. But as I was thinking this week about this message, God is there with them. And as you said this morning, you can turn around and God's going to be there. But they don't even have to turn around, because God's there. This morning I know that I'm talking to some people that are carrying some pretty heavy burdens this morning. There are people this morning hurting. And this morning maybe you don't feel God. And you feel like God is a million miles away. He's not. You may not feel him, you may not hear him, you may not see him, but God is there. The immensity of God. He's everywhere. I think back to a time in my life when I was going through the darkest, probably, place I'd ever experienced. It was shortly after I'd become a Christian. I did not feel, I did not see, I did not hear God. That was a scary thing. And I know that often we say we shouldn't go on feelings, but you know, we are still human, and oftentimes we need that feeling, we need that reassurance, we need things. And as a new Christian, I didn't know all these things, and I did not feel God. I did not hear him in my life. I could not see him working in my life. It was such a dark, dark place. And I heard a voice say, "You are lost." And I can remember that feeling of hopelessness. But I can remember one night I got down and I said, "I am not leaving this place of prayer." Just a brand new 13-year-old boy, not raised in church, but thinking to myself, I'm not leaving this place until I hear from God. And that night, the Spirit of God came and ministered to my soul. And I've looked back and I've realized time and time again that God had never left me. God was there the entire time. He was speaking. He was manifesting himself. God is there. And this morning, my friend, I don't know what you're going through. I don't know what you're facing. And this morning, God is there. In the darkest night, he is there. In the raging storm, he is there. I think back to those disciples in that storm, in that boat. And as the storm raged, Jesus came to them. He was there. If you're in the midst of suffering, of death, my friend, I'm glad that he's there. In the celebration of new life, he is there. Regardless to how you feel, regardless to what you see, regardless to what you hear, my friend, he is there. And too often in our lives, we begin to limit God and to think and ask God, "Are you still there, Lord?" You don't need to pray it. He's there. He is there. The immensity of God this morning. He's right there where you are right now. For there is not a place that God is not already there. So, my friends, this morning, as we look at the portrait of God and who he is, we see God who has no beginning. He has no end. We see a God that is immense, that he fills all space. He fills all space. Wow. He is God. When Henry Norris Russell, the Princeton astronomer, had concluded a lecture on the Milky Way, a woman came to him and asked, if our world is so little and the universe is so great, can we believe God really pays any attention to us? And Dr. Russell replied, that depends, madam, entirely how big a God you believe in. How big of a God do you believe in this morning, my friends? I love the song, How Big is God? How big and wide his vast domain. To try and tell, these lips can only start. He's big enough to rule this mighty universe, yet small enough to live within my heart. And this morning, my friend, we have experienced the wonderful Spirit of the Holy Spirit this morning. And my friend, I'm thankful that he is here. But this week, as you leave this church and wherever you go, whatever you face, whatever you go through this week, I'm glad to tell you that God is there. If you're in a great big truck driving down the highway, God's there. I even say to the kids, sometimes if you hide in the closet, think that you're going to get by with something, God's there. If you're sitting in a hospital room this week, can I tell you God's going to be there? If you're at school, kids, and you're trying to take that test that you didn't study for, God's going to be there. If you're at the Y working out in the gym, God's even there. If you're at home eating ding-dongs, he's there. Like the rest of us. God is there. And this morning, my friends, we are serving an awesome God. We are serving an immense God, a God that is huge, a God that is endless. The immensity of God. Please stand with me this morning. How big is God? How big and wide his vast domain? To try to tell, these lips can only start. He's big enough to rule this mighty universe, yet small enough to live within my heart. How big is God? How big and wide his vast domain? To try to tell, these lips can only start. He's big enough to rule this mighty universe, yet small enough to live within my heart. Brother Josh, would you dismiss us in prayer?